Kia ora koutou everyone, welcome along to this afternoon's Councillor briefing. The agenda this afternoon has Climate Change Commissioner Rod Carr joining us, then we have Future Selwyn run through that Ben will be taking us through, and the Economic Development Strategy update, and then a PX matter later in the afternoon. Ben, gonna, or should I say the young Rod Carr? It depends on. Oh, just the beard had me. No, okay. Okay, Rod, thank you so much for coming in today and talking to us, and hopefully there's some time for some questions and things as well. The microphone in front of you, just press the right hand button and I'll just hand the floor to you, and away we go.
Kia ora everybody, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm going to talk to you for about half the time, the hour that we've got. I want to answer your questions, and I'll let Sam wrangle the questions on my behalf so that everybody gets their share. He knows how to manage you better than I do. Let me start by saying a couple of things which are boring. The Climate Change Commission, many of you might have heard about it. Independent Crown entity set up in 2019. 119 members of Parliament voted in favour of establishing emissions reduction targets and establishing an independent, expert, evidence-based source of advice to help whichever governments of whatever flavours were in charge over the decades to come. The Commission has no decision rights. We decide nothing. We set no prices, we levy no taxes, we don't have a balance sheet, so we fund no change. We just give advice. Our elected leaders make all these decisions. So whatever you may see or hear in the media about the nasty Climate Change Commission doing this, doing that, we don't. We give advice. But there are a few things the politicians put in place because they knew they wouldn't always be the same people and they don't necessarily always trust each other. The first was to require that any advice that we give, we are required to engage with the public about, and before we make recommendations in certain matters, we must formally consult with the public before we finalise our advice. In addition, because of the history of advice being buried when it was inconvenient, it's a requirement on the minister who receives our advice to table it in the House within a designated number of days of having received it, or we are obliged under the Act to publish it. So none of these reports that kind of disappear for years to be discovered later. The idea being that the elected leaders get to choose, but there's some transparency about the advice they get. And if they don't like the advice, that's fine. They just have to say what they're going to do instead. So there is an accountability kind of theme throughout the work of the Commission and who we are really reporting to. A lot of the early work of the Commission has been around emissions reductions to achieve emissions budgets consistent with our targets, which were set by Parliament. But actually, there is another really important thing going on. The reality is the climate is changing. That is a scientific fact. That we know that we are causing some of it, but not all of it. There are cascading effects as a consequence of change, setting off more change. So we are going to have to learn to live in this climate changed world. Whether you voted for climate change or not, it is here, and it is here now. And we are seeing it manifest in weather events, warmer, wetter, windier, and wilder, more frequent and more extreme weather is the manifestation of the changing climate. So when it comes to New Zealand, the challenge for us is twofold. How do we create sustainable living environments? And in addition, how do we continue to produce the products and services that the affluent markets that we can afford to service will want to buy from us? Now, you can call this emissions adaptation, reduction, or whatever you like. But the challenge for New Zealand is that we actually create a lot of emissions, the way the world measures them, to create the products and services that we need to sell to affluent markets to buy the things we can never produce in New Zealand. That is the nature of the economic challenge and why emissions reduction is important, whether our contribution to global emissions is small or not. It is in our own self-interest to create the products and services affluent markets will want. Meanwhile, back at home, it is pretty clear that not all the costs and losses from adapting to the changing climate can be compensated for. Costs and losses will run into the billions, and some will be left to lie where they fall. The adaptation discussion is mainly actually about the fair share of those costs and losses, which are unavoidable. And while it manifests itself presently in conversations about floodworks and protection, the reality is nature will win this contest. That we will face more droughts, more wildfires, more inundation and inland flooding, as well as coastal erosion, rising sea levels, and ocean acidification affecting nearshore marine life. All of that is going to happen almost whatever we do. So how are we going to live with it? And the question is not, can we build our way out of it? The question is, how do we not tear our communities apart while we figure this out? And one of the challenges is the pace at which this is happening. So a little factoid that I find easy to remember because I'm simple and the numbers in this are quite simple. But about 50 million years ago, so after the dinosaurs were defunct, thanks to that meteorite, about 50 million years ago, there was an episode in the planet's development where in a pace of years, which I'll tell you about in a minute, 5,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide was put into the atmosphere as a result of volcanoes. And the planet's surface temperature is estimated to have risen by 5 degrees Celsius. You get the simple thing, 50 million years ago, 5,000 gigatons, temperature goes up by 5 degrees. Now, at the pace we are putting greenhouse gases into the air, we will put that 5,000 gigatons into the air over a period of 100 years. When nature did it over 5,000 years. And it took more than 1 million years for the planet's surface temperature to begin to decline. The scale at which we are contributing to the problem is the problem. So, come back to your good work in thinking about an emissions reduction plan so that this particular region will be able to generate the products and services that affluent markets will want, and that skilled labour will want to live in. Because what will happen over time, I believe, is that affluent markets, the Northern Hemisphere, Europe, the United States, Canada, and increasing the middle classes in India and China are going to be becoming dreadfully concerned about the environmental impact, not just of what is produced, but what they are consuming. And that it is not a case of earning a green premium. It will become a case of being able to access those markets. And the world will still have a place for dirty products, but they will be sold at a discount. And the challenge for New Zealand is we are not a lower cost economy that can service low income markets producing products at a dirty discount. Where does life start for local government? Local government, it turns out, is going to be right in the front line of adapting to the changing climate. You know that. You're probably already experiencing it. Central government, in the name of devolution, is pushing responsibility as far away from the centre as it can, as fast as it can. And part of that is to fix you with knowledge and responsibility for consequences that central government knows it can never afford to underwrite. Your emissions reduction plan is beginning to take responsibility for the environmental impact of the goods and services that you provide to your communities. It's an ambitious plan, and it's a plan that is realistic in taking, at least at the horizon, responsibility for all emissions, including Scope 3 emissions. You've got to start somewhere, but you have to realize in the end that what happens in your supply chain is as much your responsibility and opportunity to make a difference as the things you directly control in your own areas of responsibility. So the view I would bring to you is the work has started, but the pace and scale at which it needs to be done is underestimated. But the opportunities are real for New Zealand. In New Zealand's case, emissions reduction is really a simple task, believe it or not. It's a simple task because we have choices, and those choices are for us to make. All of the technologies that are needed to materially reduce our greenhouse gas emissions exist today. Our emissions come from energy production and use, transport, and land use. Energy production and use, currently 40% of all of the energy produced and used in New Zealand is from renewable sources: hydro, geothermal, wind, solar, and a bit of run of the river. The other 60% is fossil fuels, imported largely fossil fuels, coal and liquid. Those are long supply chains. They are vulnerable supply chains, and they are expensive forms of energy now and into the future. So moving rapidly towards a greater proportion of renewable energy, not only used by the council, but available and accessible to your businesses and communities, will make this a more affordable and more attractive place to live. That is what will attract talent, and talent is what will power the engine in a region. So energy production and use is a key opportunity for New Zealand. And we don't need anything that has not already been invented. Yes, there is this matter of the dry year. How do we store intermittently generated renewable electricity? Not overnight, that is a solved problem. Not between weeks, that is a problem that will be solved pretty quickly, but between years. And the storage of excess energy produced this year for use in 3 or 4 years' time is technically available, it's just rather expensive. The use of biomass for storing energy is now known and understood. Huntly Power Station imported 1,000 tonnes of blackwood pellets from Canada. Those pellets can be stored outside without cover for up to 4 years. That's the kind of storage for biomass that solves our dry year problem. Why don't they just do it? Turns out it's more expensive than Indonesian coal. Turns out we could do it. At some price point, we will do it. When it comes to local, combusting fossil fuels in the open air to generate energy for industry, for businesses, for home heating is nuts. There are cheaper alternatives everywhere. Ground transport. We need to stop the combustion of liquid fossil fuels to move us and stuff around. Virtually all of the technologies that are needed to achieve that exist today. Often questions are asked about the whole of life emissions to create and use cars and trucks. To that extent, roughly half of all the whole of life emissions from a vehicle are incurred the day it rolls off the production line. It's a little bit more for battery electric cars, than it is for internal combustion engine cars, because internal combustion engine cars have huge emissions during their lifetime. And it does matter for battery electric cars whether they're charged with renewable electricity or some other source. But rough orders of magnitude, and this is the one that is interesting, battery electric cars, if you're paying in the order of 20 cents a kilowatt hour for power, are about 5 cents a kilometre of energy cost to drive. Fuel cell hydrogen, green hydrogen made at 15 New Zealand dollars a kilo, gets you a kilometre for about 15 cents. And at $2.50 a litre, petrol costs you 25 cents to get a kilometre. So the operating costs of low emission fuels are already well ahead of the operating costs of internal combustion engine vehicles. Of course, because they're newer to market, there are not as many second-hand and lower priced ones. Chinese manufacturers intend to dominate the global market in low emissions transport technology. They've made that a strategic imperative. They are producing sound, reliable, safe, and low-cost vehicles, to the extent where the US now accuses them of dumping and has put tariffs on the import of those vehicles to the United States to foster a domestic motor vehicle industry. For those of you who were around in the 1970s and early 1980s, this sounds like a familiar trick. Raise tariffs, raise costs, hope that you can build an industry behind the tariff barrier, because if you can't, you've just made things more expensive for your consumers. So transport is on the way. You do want to think about hydrogen for trucks, but largely battery electric will do, privately owned and operated. And there's some data about which types of the fleet are likely to move sooner. When we move from transport to land use, things get really interesting. Land use covers what we do with the land, including ruminant pastoral agriculture, food processing, biomass production, and carbon storage. And all of these things compete for land use. And some of those uses are incompatible with other uses, and some require other things like water or fertile ground. But New Zealand is blessed with a large amount of a very diverse portfolio of land classes and types. We need to be mindful that land use has changed in this country for hundreds of years and will continue to change into the future. But change is sometimes uncomfortable, inconvenient, scary, and uncertain. And because land is an inherent part of identity, then the process of changing land use can be very challenging to identity. If you've been steeped in the land for generations, the prospect of land use change can be alienating and debilitating. But the reality is the climate is going to change how our land can be used, even if we don't want it to be used differently. And there are going to be many challenges confronting land use change, including the competition for water, nutrients, and property rights. So when it comes to creating the fastest growing region in the country, you guys win. When it comes to creating one of the most attractive places to live in, you win. The challenge is, how do you manage all of this looking out 50 years so you don't have your children and grandchildren wonder what you did when you had a chance to make a difference? The Climate Change Commission is an advisor to central government, not local government, not the business community, not individual households or private individuals. But the work it does can be used to inform all of those communities and the decisions that will confront them today and in the years ahead. That's probably enough of that lecture from me. Let's go into your questions about how I can be helpful to you as leaders making some quite tough choices. Kia ora.
Thanks, Rod. Informative and challenging, as always. And first up question is, I know you've just said it's beyond your remit, but, you know, what is your advice to local councils, and particularly our council, which is a little bit different, as you've said, to many others, where growth and change and population are kind of things that are ever evolving here. What do you say to us, and what do you identify as our key challenges from outside?
So I think this is personal, this is not the commission. If you try and step yourself forward to 2050 and beyond, and then look back, what would success look like? What from the future looking back would you want? You would want a thriving community, and thriving isn't just lots of people with lots of money. Thriving is a community which has coherence and resilience, diversity. Thriving is a community that is attractive for people of all ages and stages to want to come and belong to. Thriving is a community which has a certain amount of turnover so that it is able to accept new arrivals and willing to allow people to leave. So a thriving community has to be an open community and prosperous in the broadest sense. But in addition, it's going to have to be resilient to some of this changing climate stuff. There are going to be wildfires coming with those nor'westers, and they are going to be damaging and devastating. There are going to be droughts, which are going to drive businesses out of business. And what is that going to mean for the local community? Resilience isn't just about getting knocked over and standing up again. Resilience is about getting knocked over time and time again and doing all you can to know and help your neighbours stand up again. So I think, thinking about the thriving, what does that mean? The resilient, what does that mean? And the low emissions, because those are the lifestyles people will want to live, and it is the products and services that affluent people will want to buy. So I think if you try and get your head around that and then bring it to your local context and say, well, what are the levers that we can control? And unfortunately, you can't control population growth. And New Zealand even chooses not to control net migration. So who chooses to turn up in your area is beyond your control. And in fact, there's this rather bizarre thing is the more thriving you are, the more people will want to show up. The more prosperous you are, the more people will want to have a share of it. The contest around unable to control population is how do you plan for something you cannot control? How do you make sure that the infrastructure you are responsible for is built out of harm's way? It strikes me as completely nuts that since 2015 we have built 16,000 houses in New Zealand on floodplains, on the grounds we now can build better drains. Really? If you look at what happened in Auckland, it wasn't because the leaves clogged the drains. That was unhelpful, but trivial. We need not to do dumb things, not to think we can beat nature, to understand that there is going to be more rain from the sky because there is more water in the air, and it's going to turn up in places it hasn't turned up at before, and it is going to want to flow to the rivers, to the sea, and if there's too much in the rivers will move. So the challenges with stop banks, how big, how long, for how much? Because if you do that, what are you not doing about thinking about building a climate resilient infrastructure? So come back to your own region. You know best the resources that you have in your region. You know best the kinds of people who live here and are likely to want to come here. And it's not for a bystander to tell you about what you know best about. But do put yourselves in that position of what does success look like in 2050 looking back? What do you mean by thriving? What do you mean by resilient? And what do you mean by low emissions? And how do you, using the tools you've got, bias the outcomes in favour of those, if those are the outcomes that you desire?
Cool, thank you. And we've been through a long-term plan process and heard a lot from our community on things that are important to them. A few of the submissions that we've heard have highlighted that data around emissions is exponential, and yet sea level rise and temperature rise are linear, and trying sort of highlighting the difference between those two, using sea level rise at at Littleton, and rainfall at Lincoln over 100 years, and mean temperatures over a few hundred years. Can you give us some advice on how we handle that sort of science and presentation?
Yeah, so one of the things is the Climate Change Commission, looking at the targets review, has to ask itself, since 2019, is there new science? Do we understand the changing climate more now than we did then? And is that change significant? The conclusion is there's no new science about atmospheric chemistry, ocean acidification, any of that stuff. Actually, we knew that science decades ago, and it's proving to be true. The new science that's worrying climate scientists is tipping points and cascading effects, and their closer likelihood of being triggered now than was expected in the science 10, 20 years ago. And it's really simple if you think about, us as organisms. If you get a temperature and you're 40 degrees Celsius, you're pretty hot and bothered and not very well. If you're 41, 41.5, you're in hospital. If you're 42.5, you're dead. And when they put you in the freezer, you don't come back to life. So the problem with some of these arguments about it's not as bad as it has been, the climate's always been changing, temperature's not rising precisely as they thought, the reality is that the closer we get to +2 degrees Celsius, the more is the evidence we've not been there in the last 300 million years. So if you want to take a least regret strategy, I would assume that more greenhouse gas emissions are bad. At the pace and scale we're doing it, less is better. And if we buy down some time and risk, we will be better for it. When we then flip to the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air, which is 80% of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet today, set aside agriculture, come to this combustion of fossil fuels. There are very local health effects, which mean whatever happens in Beijing or Paris, we are the people who breathe this crap at ground level, right? The Ministry of Health has estimated that ground level inhaled particulates, largely from the combustion of fossil fuels, contribute directly or indirectly to 3,500 deaths a year and $2.7 billion worth of healthcare costs. Why do we do that? Well, we used to do it because we didn't have a choice and we didn't know. Now we have a choice and we do know. It's on us that we continue to do this. Because what? It's cheap. For who? Not us. So I think, sometimes the argument gets lost in the dancing on the head of the pin of the science, and we forget it is now in our own self-interest to decarbonize transport. And because it often comes up and people say, yeah, but what about the whole of life emissions from a battery electric car compared to an internal combustion engine car? Whole of life emissions are about 40% less from a battery electric car, counting all the costs of production compared to a new internal combustion engine car. Would you scrap an internal combustion engine car before the end of its technical life in order to replace it with a battery electric car? If you were doing the greenhouse gas emissions profile, you probably wouldn't, because remember the emissions embodied in that vehicle. but you'd sure as hell stop importing them into New Zealand, and you'd sure as heck stop manufacturing them. So again, fossil gas connections, less of a big issue in the South Island because it's all bottled gas. So in some ways it's going to be easier to gradually phase it out or swap it for biogas if that's ever available affordably in volume. But why would we continue to connect new residences to a gas network to burn an increasingly scarce and expensive resource that is bad for the planet and bad for household health, when there are more affordable, readily available, healthier options today? So when a household uses fossil gas to make hot water, it emits 1 tonne of greenhouse gas per annum. If the same house used electricity, it would be a fraction of those emissions. So there are some dumb things which we just choose to keep doing. The argument being, well, people should have choice. The problem being, people don't live with the consequences of their choice. They impose it on others.
Thank you. Grant.
One of the opportunities, or it's happening in Selwyn now, and I suppose the question I'm asking is, do you think we should include it in our rules and regulations? One of the developers is providing, as part of standard building houses, solar panels and wide electric car charging point in his house as an offer. Given the high growth area that we are, potentially we could actually, in our district plan, require that of new builds. As a percentage of a new house build, it wouldn't be excessively expensive to do that. I suppose the question that some of the people might raise is, and you could perhaps help on that score, is that amount of money be ring fenced from debt to equity ratios when you borrow money, because a lot of people are actually up to the debt to equity ratio to build up, buy a house, and to a certain extent the market is starting to provide that as a marketing option. Do you think that we should do it as a regulatory approach?
Yeah. Well, certainly over time we've got smarter with regulation, like the double glazing insulation kind of stuff, and the emissions controlled heating systems and so forth. So first of all, there's a lot of precedent for not just letting people choose, but actually requiring certain quality. It would have been great if 30 years ago we'd moved more aggressively to make sure our new builds were not on floodplains, were well insulated, but we stuffed around and built some bad, cheap stuff. So I'm not going to actually answer the question of whether this district council should or shouldn't do something, but a few interesting sort of challenging issues around home solar stuff. The first is, it's estimated that only about 1/3 of New Zealand's current houses are suitable for solar panels on roof. Mainly, we built them facing the wrong way. Secondly, they're overshadowed by the neighbour's tree. Thirdly, they're built with, in some cases, protected facades for streetscape reasons. So actually, when you look at all of the homes in New Zealand, about 700,000 of them would be suitable for deployment of solar panels for own use. So that's the second thing. Is we have this problem of what we call the principal agency problem. 1/3 of New Zealanders live as tenants in houses owned by landlords. And of course, the tenant pays the energy bills and the landlord essentially provides the capital. And we haven't yet got to the point where tenants will pay a premium for the lower cost of energy provided by solar compared to their sense that they'll just turn things on and turn things off, or buy a cord of wood or whatever. So there's a principal agency problem with residential tenancy. There's a built structure with the existing housing stock. So we come to your question, not so much in Selwyn, but across New Zealand, is should we be very mindful when we consent new builds about their whole of life energy equation? Yes, we should. And their whole of life emissions? Yes, we should. How you go about regulating that in a way that makes it affordable is interesting. Many of the banks now provide green finance at a discount to their standard lending. There's a bunch of reasons why that's attractive to them. But you're right, if people are already up against a debt constraint, putting another $25,000 on them for solar panels can be the tipping point at which point they might struggle to be able to afford the savings they will make because of the debt constraint, not because of their cash flow.
Yeah, Grant.
Just to add to that, the same person who was telling me suggested when you talked about locality constraints around putting solar in, about the voucher concept where you'd be an off-farm solar farm somewhere and you'd buy the equivalent amount of supply at that solar farm, and it would be, you get the credits for that, so you wouldn't necessarily have it on your building. You just
can
buy
do
a credit
power purchase agreements and swaps and stuff. But I'll give you, this is a bit out. I'll give you a little case study about how challenging the behaviour change around this is. So my son-in-law is running a solar as a service business targeting schools. Right? His business proposition is really quite simple. He goes up to a school and he says to the school, my business will put solar panels on the roof of your school buildings. You will get all of the electrons that are generated, and you will get them at 15% less than the price you pay for the rest of the electricity you use in that school. Right? You will save money. You are not required to pay 1 cent up front or 1 cent on any regular basis. First objection the school has is, well, what if we want to change our mind? So he says, here's a schedule for the next 25 years of the depreciating value of the panels. At any point, you can buy them off me. At the end of the 25 years, they're yours to keep. Then the objection is, but we don't own the building. The Ministry of Education owns the building. And he goes, here's a contract the Ministry of Education has approved that you of a board of trustees can sign up for. And you're thinking, how hard can it be? You only save money. You have no obligation to pay anything to anybody. You get to keep the kit. You can buy it any time. And the Ministry of Education has said, you, the Board of Trustees, are the decision maker. He's got 4 schools on board. And some of them are just going, it's a shell game. So behaviour is really challenging. There are some opportunities here that can make the world a better place, and people are just not getting their head around the decision to make the world a better place. Interesting.
Thank you. Megan.
Yes, kia ora. Apologies for lateness again, and particularly to you, Dr. Carr, for coming in halfway through. I have 2 questions, but first of all, I just wanted to say I liked you using the stop bank example. So when you were talking about just let nature be nature, I think that's really quite interesting and relevant for particularly for me and my background, because I'm here as a mana whenua representative. So we are at a site that is being regularly inundated by the coastal hazards out there. So my question actually relates to land use and land use opportunities or changes in land use, in particular for this district. Yep. So looking at our current land use, where would you see future opportunities to change that would make a meaningful impact to become more climate resilient?
Yeah. So we come to a couple of things. One is food and fibre. Okay? The world is still going to need affordable sources of protein and carbohydrate. But increasingly, that's going to be generated in controlled growing environments, because the risk of putting all this stuff outside and praying it doesn't rain, or does rain, or the storm doesn't come, or does, this is going to, crop failure, not specifically talking about Selwyn region, but crop failure is going to become increasingly common around the planet. So controlled growing environments are capital intensive, but equally create the certainty that gives you an insurable risk, that gives you access to bank finance, that enables you to produce all year round. And the challenge for us is, if we're not in that game, but everybody else is, will we lose our comparative advantage in the production of food protein? Because it's not so much everything ending up as a sort of factory manufactured soup or something. It is the case that the costs and risks of conducting agriculture the way we have on the land that we've had are going to go higher. The banks are going to be more reluctant to lend. The insurers are going to provide more expensive and limited coverage. And if the failures happen in sort of sequential years, then the business entities are going to begin to fail as well. So coming back to land use, it may be that we're looking at more capital intensity, whether it's bringing the water, the nutrients, or covered crops or whatever. Secondly, biomass for energy is going to be a real opportunity, that the price points are still, looking challenging, but you need to find crops that don't need replanting. So things that can be coppiced, things that you can literally mechanically mow, harvest, gather, and use. Because the minute you throw human labor into any of this, it falls to bits really quickly. It's too expensive. That land use will also include, where appropriate, solar farms, wind farms, and water storage, because we have this bizarre kind of too much and then not enough problem coming our way. And the challenge for Auckland has been, well, how do you retrofit Auckland to be a monsoon city? It's really hard to retrofit a city once you built it for one set of climate conditions and then discover it's another. Whereas there are cities in India that are built to be flooded, to let the water find its way out, rather than to try and hold it back. So again, having a deep understanding of your local topography, having a deep understanding of where the rain will fall and where it will run to, and not assuming that the best solution is to build a big concrete channel or a big bund to hold it in, I think is beginning to think in a way that says we are part of nature. We're not above and beyond nature. And roads and bridges are going to be increasingly vulnerable. It's not a direct answer to, so what would you do with this 100 hectares of land? But we are going to see some land uses that people are not familiar with and might object to because they're not familiar with them. The solar farm next door, the wind farm over there, the water storage capacity here, when you think, well, we've got perfectly good river. And you go, yeah, but the perfectly good river might or might not be the place that you want to be able to know you've got water.
That everything you've said just now will feed into when we consider further our economic development strategy and what we can enable and should enable moving forward. So really helpful. But I did say I have two questions.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm allowed to go? Okay, great. My second question was about, I'm aware that the Climate Change Commission recently did quite a lot of research into how to engage with communities with retreat discussions. Yep. And I wanted to know from you, what your advice to us would be.
It's inherently a local phenomenon. Beware of central government, right? Because it's easy to kind of let the word retreat fall on the table. But this whole thing about identity and land, and mana whenua, this piece of land is not the same as that piece of land. It's not easy when your identity is deeply set in a piece of land to go, yeah, well, we'll swap you this for that. Some of the whole conversation has to be about the recognition that just and equitable doesn't necessarily mean everybody gets the same. There may be some circumstances in which costs and losses have to lie where they fall. And those may be circumstances where people had full notice at the time they made their choices. It may be circumstances where if you publish on land titles all of the hazards, you say to the next buyer, you are fully informed. Don't come looking at us when you get washed out. If you're at the end of a long road tacked in a floodplain over multiple bridges, when it all turns to custard, is it a reasonable expectation that the public purse will put that all back how it was? Because I think the answer to that question is it is no longer a reasonable expectation. If you are at the end of the long road with 3 bridges before your neighbour, you're in trouble in the next 25 years. I can't predict that it will take you out, but what I'm increasingly confident of is if it does, it won't be put back. So trying to be, the beginning of the retreat conversation is actually not starting with retreat, it's starting with transparency. It's starting with fixing property owners with knowledge. Knowledge they might not want to have. Right? They might not thank you for telling them they're in harm's way. Their banks might know before they do that they're in harm's way. But if you don't tell people, you can't reasonably expect them to make sensible choices. If you do tell people, they still may not make sensible choices. But where you have the lever to inform people, I think there is an obligation on transparency.
Thank you. Malcolm.
Yeah, it's on that very subject, Rod. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Boulder Bank at the back of Tamutu, where the Rakaia River disgorges tons and tons of alluvial shingle down the coast, has been overtopped multiple times in the last year. Previous to that, it was 40 years ago. The time before that, it was 70 years ago. So we are seeing salination of soils in local areas. And as we see sea level rise, we will see Te Ora get bigger, as it was way back in 1850, when it banked up to the edge of Lincoln. Now, in the years between, there are multiple generations of farming practices going there. Some of those farmers have said to me, well, who's going to pay for me to retreat? And it's a bit late to put something on their limb now to say, hey, I'm sorry, but you're in a flood area, because their great-great-great-grandfather established the farm. And this is
the reality.
This is the issue.
Because A, you need to put it there as soon as you know, and B, they need to come to understand that they're not going to get compensated. There's not enough money.
Well, I think we've got an education job to do, Councillor.
Thanks, Malcolm. Sophie.
Yeah, I think we've got a running theme going here. My question's kind of, so a lot of what we've been talking about so far is often around behaviour change and the role of regulation in that, but what we've actually got is a government that is wanting to remove regulations to enable more choice, and we have yet to see whether that's going to actually result in good choices in terms of climate change and stuff like that. And I'm just wondering, like, in terms of retreat, I think possibly one of the ones that's going to happen more frequently isn't going to be even regulated retreat. It's going to be insurance retreat and lending retreat, which is really weird, because I don't want the market to have to be ruling this, but actually I think the market's going to end up being the one left holding the baby. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I'll take off my climate change hat and I'll put on my PhD in risk and insurance and my director of ASB hat. Yes. The reality is insurance is annually renewable. The insurers, contrary to all the expectations that they're clever and they are pricing risk, basically look at their prior period losses and set premiums on the basis of recovering those losses and anticipating the future looks more like the immediate past. It is a loss smoothing business. It is not a clever actuarial business. So as the losses from climate rise dramatically globally and begin to hit the reinsurers, and there are only 5 global reinsurers, the costs are going to go up dramatically. As they filter through to the front line, some of the retail, the bits in the window that you and I actually buy insurance from, are going to look at those premium prices and go, I don't want the public to hate me by jacking the premium that used to be $2,000 to $10,000. I will lift the deductible or withdraw that cover, rather than say it's available but at this massive increase in price. So I think a lot of the insurer retreat is going to be less obvious to many insured. It won't all be in the premium. The premiums will go up 20, 30%, possibly per annum, possibly for the next 10 years. But increasingly, your cover will be shrinking. The banks know that. So here's where the real problem is. The banks lend knowing that you're insured against some sort of catastrophic loss, but recognizing the insurer can change their insurance cover every year, whereas the bank knows you can't repay their loan just because your insurance cover is withdrawn. So the banks need to anticipate your insurability, not just have you got cover today. And I think that nexus people have yet to understand is that the banks will increasingly not provide lending, even if you've got a 1-year policy that provides insurance, because the banks will be concerned that they become the residual risk holder for what will become uninsurable risks. And then the question is, well, what if you had to price that risk through the interest rate? What price would you do that? And again, because of the public approbation, maybe they'll just say, I just won't lend, rather than lend at a 3% premium. So I think all of that is, quote, the market working itself through, which will lead to stranded assets. It will lead to people sitting, as they do in South Dunedin, in houses they can't sell, that aren't worth what they paid for them. If they keep servicing the mortgage, the bank will look the other way. And if the worst happens, they walk away with nothing. There's about 30 communities that look like South Dunedin in New Zealand today. So South Dunedin gets a bit of a bad rap because it's the poster child, but they're not the only ones.
Thanks, Sophie. Elizabeth.
Hi, Rod. I'm really sorry. I'm terrible from remembering names, but I went to a really fantastic green-based movie recently, and overall they were discussing the way forward, and they didn't say how it could happen, but they were just talking about different theoretical ideas. The question that I asked them, but they couldn't give me an answer, and I'm going to ask you the same question, is based on what I saw in that movie, and this was an international based movie, so it was interviewing people from all across the world, is the future actually going back to a more simple way of living and the simpler lifestyle choices that were of the yesteryear, or are we going to be moving forward into what is really a very, very expensive high-tech way to retain the current style of living standards that we expect today?
Scenarios, great fun. I don't think people are willingly going to go back to a simpler life. We've created an energy-intense form of social structure as a result of being able to liberate the energy from fossil fuels. I mean, there's extraordinary technology that we figured out how to get that much energy and that density to roll back the night and power our transport and fly planes and stuff. I just don't think willingly and easily people are going to go, you know what, I'm just not going to do any of that anymore. I'll go back to how my great-grandparents lived. Now, we could collapse into a less intensive world. Go.
Just a test.
5-minute warning.
So, yeah.
I know how that works. Yeah. So I think that the challenge is we can spend a lot of time having great games over scenarios and which way it's going to go. The question is, how do you best prepare for an unknown and uncertain future? Because I don't know the answer to that question. Will we? Part of why people talk about a just transition is the belief that if you don't do a just transition, the transition will fail and you'll get collapse. That most of transitions in history have been a fight with the powerful elite and encumbered, rich and influential, who have resisted the change. And you go through history, and whether it's the feudalism failing because basically the plague killed all the people and land wasn't as valuable as it was, whether it was the collapse of an agricultural economy because of industrialization, the agrarian people weren't that happy about the loss of their source of livelihood to the mechanization of agriculture. So I think you've got a history that says, can we as a civilization pull off a transition to a low emissions future while maintaining the energy intensity of the civilization that we've built? If we can, the argument is the only way you can do that is through a just transition. Otherwise, the alienated, dispossessed, and vulnerable will burn the thing down because they have nothing to lose. So in some ways, my conversations about just transition are not because of some moral suasion that this is the right and proper thing to do. It's utterly self-interested. If you have a just transition and you bring the most vulnerable with you, it's because if you don't, they will screw you over. So it is in our own self-interest. Now, there are already all the known technologies we need to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air is the biggie. You know, if you don't fix that one, it doesn't matter what we do with agriculture, seriously. So 80% of greenhouse gas emissions are CO2 that come from combusting fossil fuels in the open air. Today, as of today, 80% of the coal that is burnt on the planet is burnt to make 1/3 of all the electricity used on the planet today. There are known technologies to replace all of that now without inventing a single new thing. But the rich West has to give that technology to the developing world if they're going to do it. Because it is still much cheaper to put cheap human labor in a coal mine, dig up 100-million-year-old rocks and burn them than it is to build a new fill-in-the-gap nuclear power station or solar array at $1 million a megawatt, or wind turbines, or any of the above. But we know all those technologies. The question is, are we prepared to give them to the poor or not? And apparently we're not, quite frankly. There have been less flows of capital from the rich north to the poor south in the last 2 years than there were in the 2 years before that. So we're going in the wrong direction.
Rod, you've heard the types of questions that we are asking of you, and that's probably because we're asking them of ourselves as well, and the community asking them of us too. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I'm just wondering, given what you've started with and the type of conversation we've had over the last half hour, are there some final thoughts and some concluding comments you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, you're absolutely, I think, in the box seat to do a really great job for this generation and future generations. You have choices other regions in New Zealand and other countries on the planet just don't have. So I'll give you another little anecdote. I did some work with the United Nations on greenwashing. And the Secretary General of the United Nations was meeting with this little group, and he just got back from Pakistan when they'd had their floods last year. 30 million displaced people, over 30% of the country underwater. And he said, you know, the real problem there is it's not the rain, it's not the floods. It's that within 30 years, the glaciers that feed the rivers of the Indus Valley, which is the water they drink and use for agriculture, will be gone. I don't know what you do if you're in Pakistan. Leave is probably a good option. And there's going to be people all over the planet for whom staying where they are is simply not able to sustain life. So we don't have that problem in New Zealand. We have some Pacific neighbours who have that problem. You don't have that problem in Selwyn. So my view is this is on us to make the decisions with the choices we have, because not everybody has those choices. And if we screw it up, we can't blame Beijing or Paris or Washington. So the next thing is creating the kind of place where talent wants to be is going to be really important. If it is a high-tech future and driven by data centers and software and all that kind of AI and stuff like that, you want to have the high-income jobs that attract the kind of people who want the kind of community that you can build and sustain here. So you've got to be mindful about the businesses you want, because the businesses will attract the kind of people you want. And the kind of people you attract will determine the kind of communities that you build. And given the starting point of this conversation is you don't control population as such. It's given to you by the borders of New Zealand. And internal migration fills in the rest. What you can do is attract the kind of people you want to attract by signaling the kind of communities that you have and you want to build. So that would be one kind of line, is it's not hopeless at all. It's quite hopeful. And then I would just say is it does worry me a lot when I look at the nor'westers and the drying and the wildfires. We better be ready to fight some fires, literally, because they are coming. And they will nibble around the edges of the interface between urban development and rural communities as they did in Australia. And that's pretty tough and pretty scary. And we've seen it in the Port Hill fires. Just because you have one doesn't mean you're done. So I think thinking about water and thinking about fire and thinking about storms and wind, and that intersects with how you regulate land use and what you disclose to who, when, and setting yourself up as an entity with a balance sheet that isn't going to get stitched up and go broke.
Thank you. It feels very Captain Planet, Earth, Wind, Fire, Water. We appreciate your time today for us, but also your leadership in this conversation for our country and the work that you're providing into central government and their policy settings. So, yeah, all the best as you continue in this role and for as long as that lasts. And we also appreciate you being here today, though, for us and the expertise you provided over the last decade through Canterbury University and other institutions ongoing. Thank you, Rod.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's always a privilege to come and talk to people who actually have decision rights. Good luck.
Bit of a hard speaker to follow there, but see what we can do.
Yeah, we were just going to pass comment on that. No judgment coming. Just while Sam's showing Dr. Carr out, he's just asked me to introduce the next speakers, which is our lovely George, who's soon to be married, and Bob.
Oh no, this is streamed. It's going to be a big invite list now.
Yes, there is, George. Sorry. Who's going to take us through our future Selwyn strategies? So I'm going to hand over to you, good fellows.
Yeah, quite timely and topical given what sort of Rob was talking about, I guess, the future of what Selwyn, the place that we have in that decision making and the type of people and business and activities we want to attract to Selwyn. So this is a pivotal piece of work and a piece of work which has been missing from Selwyn for its entire existence. There's never been a strategic framework which provides a direction for development and decision making at this governance group. So a bit about the backstory. So it started off being a replacement to the district development strategy, Selwyn 2031. It was going to be Selwyn 51, but a decision was made probably 2 or 3 years ago that actually we need an overarching strategic direction, strategic outcome type document, which therefore we've got future Selwyn. So once the strategy is in place, it will be a strategic framework, which will be the anchor and the alignment point for all other documents and decisions that are made. So as you can see, there's the top level strategy, then you've got your sub-strategic work there, then that flows into all your action plans, your long-term plans, your district plans, and those type of things. So that's the actions to the strategy. So it is a very long-term document. So this would go over 30, 50, 100 years and beyond. So each of those decisions each year will slowly add up to become actually securing that outcome that we want. It will be used as a decision-making tool for processes like long-term plans to ensure that when decisions are made, there's actually alignment with an overarching strategic direction and outcome. So it will provide a tool for you to use when you do come to those tricky decisions on what way you should be going. Does it have alignment with where we actually want to go, or does it not? It does have a vision for Selwyn, with this being Selwyn being a livable, innovative, connected place filled with opportunity and prosperity. Also has a range of outcomes and directions, and George will fill in the detail there soon. Bit about the development to date. So it has been to this council quite a few times. We had Anne Molyneux early on, workshopping things like vision, aspirations, archetypes, so where council wants to play in certain spaces. There's been workshops with staff. It's been developed in alignment with other strategies which are currently under development as well. It's taken into consideration consultation through LTP, district plans, the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan processes as well. And the next step for it is a full public consultation piece. So we'll be bringing it back to council for endorsement next Wednesday, and then there'll be a full consultation. We'll present the comms plan at that meeting as well. So I guess the two big things to discuss today is to provide an open space for any last discussions before that council meeting next week, and also to have some discussions around potential hearing arrangements as well, with our recommendation that it's a full council hearing process, quite similar to the long-term plan process. So I'll pass over to George to talk a bit about the detail, to walk you through the website.
Kia ora koutou, and thanks Rob for giving us an introduction of the background for Waikirikiri Kitua Future Selwyn. I sent a email round with the URL to access the site, and hopefully everybody's received that and has had access without trouble. If not, please come talk to me afterwards and I'll be happy to try and work on the access. But if not, we're kind of going to go through a bit of a user journey for the website today through the experience. So that's probably a key point to bring up, is that Waikirikiri Kitua Future Selwyn is very different to the district development strategy and any other strategies, plans that we've developed, as it is a live integrated web-based platform, and it has a lot of interactive elements. It lives in ArcGIS Experience Builder, and that's because it has a large spatial component, so lots of maps for context, but also setting our future direction. But it's not just a spatial plan, it's a lot broader than that. It's meant to be our long-term intergenerational approach to well-being, sustainability, resilience, growth, change, development, pretty much everything that Rod just talked about that we need to be future-focused and thinking about. So this is setting our direction in terms of where we want to go, the communities we want to shape and foster and have here, and the kind of place we want to live. So it's a future focused piece of work, and I'll just go through the experience now. So if you were to open the website, you'd see a splash screen which gives the user a real short snippet of how to use the platform. And from there, you'll come onto a landing page here. We'll just adjust the zoom real quickly. So you'll come to a landing page, which works much like a executive summary, a table of contents for the strategy. Future Selwyn structured across 4 different parts. There's the part 1 is our context and evidence base. Part 2 is some of the stuff that Rob was just talking about future scenarios, what may or may not eventuate, the unknown unknowns and uncertainties, trying to anticipate those, understand those, and ensure that we're thinking about what could unfold, recognizing there's lots of different futures and there's not just one path to where we want to go. Part 3 is the strategy itself, and this is where the spatial and strategic direction is set, and is probably the most important component of Waikirikiri Kitua Future Selwyn. So there's our strategic framework, which sets out the long-term aspiration. There's the vision that Rob read out to you, but there's a longer spirit of Selwyn, which kind of puts a bit of meat on the bones of what that vision is. Then there's our strategic outcomes and direction. So kind of where do we want to go and what do we need to do to get there. Our strategic priorities are about where we're going to focus our efforts to unlock transformational change. We've got 6 of those. I'll run through those in a bit. Because Waikirikiri Kitua Future Selwyn is our kind of urban form direction for the future, similar to how the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan shapes the urban form for the sub-region. We've also got a specific section on the urban form direction, which sets out those changes we need to see in our urban form over the future to achieve that vision, those outcomes. And that's also an intermediary between the strategic framework and the district picture, which is that spatial expression of the long-term strategic direction within Waikirikiri Kitua Future Selwyn, and it's part of forming up the next step that Rob alluded to about our area plans, which is one of the outputs, which is detailed spatial plans for three areas. Obviously, we have existing Malvern and Ellesmere area plans from 2016 that need a review and updating, so that what will happen. And also we've got Eastern Selwyn area, which is the Selwyn component of Greater Christchurch. The Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan sets the higher level broad direction, but there's a lot of detail to be worked through, which is what's anticipated for the Eastern Selwyn area plan. Part 4 is monitoring. That hasn't been developed yet, so we're planning to go out to the community with the first 3 parts. And when we have that direction from the community that we are moving in the right direction on our strategic direction, and we've considered everything that's important to them, and they can see themselves in the framework and the vision and the future that we're envisaging for our communities, then we'll develop the monitoring once we have a good steer from them. So from the landing page, you can navigate from these buttons to some of the key parts. So you would have seen the strategic framework before. I'll probably just touch on some of the points that Rod brought up. I just want to kind of make a connection there that I didn't anticipate. But about thriving communities, he asked, what does that look like for you? And this is part of what the kind of co-popper of Waikirikiri Ki Tua Future Someone is about, is saying that's what this means for us and what resilient communities mean for us. So the directions is what we'll do with our strategic partners, with our communities, with the business community in order to get to the outcomes and the vision that we want. So quite timely, and I do want to dovetail off what Rod says because he speaks so well, but that's what we envisage are the directions for resilient communities, thriving communities, inclusive communities, and that will make Selwyn a great place to call home. So that's the relationship between the outcomes and the directions as well as the overarching vision. So heading back to the home page, we've got another button that takes you to the urban form direction, which is quite important. This builds on the outcome for a sustainable and connected urban form, and this describes the changes in our urban form. You start to see some of the interactive elements of Future Selwyn. That's interactive maps that you can zoom in on and find out details about. So there's these pop-ups that will give details of the different towns. So it says about Rolleston as an emerging city in the future. Talks about Lincoln in terms of being an education town, a net zero town with that ambition there. And part of that town network is matched with our movement network, which is how we're going to, the future kind of public transport and connections we want for the district. And then how that leads into the different services and facilities that we need to see in our neighborhoods and our communities. The changes in urban form, which is part of what Rod touched on, that kind of uncomfortable change. Things will be different. They're going to look different, and they're things that we might not have seen before. So this is trying to preempt or anticipate the changes that will inevitably come and make sure that we get good outcomes from them. And then this sets out the different changes on our urban form we might see depending on that town network, whether it's an emerging city, our strategic towns, local towns, our smaller settlements. And that leads into, I'll go back to the homepage again, to our district picture. Again, you get a splash screen showing how to use the map. And this is our spatial expression of that long-term strategic direction. So it's a GIS-based map, so you can turn on the elements that are of interest to you. The splash screen will, of course, tell users who are unfamiliar with this sort of thing as to how it might work. And then you've got the ability to zoom in on the town, see the future direction, key information about different infrastructure. We'll pick on Rolleston because that's where we are, and hear about the inland ports. You can click on to water bodies to hear about the water bodies. It describes the water bodies. So that sets the spatial direction for the future. If I go back to the start, that directs to the 3 key parts of the strategy, but we've got 4 parts. There's a menu at the top here. The first part is the context and evidence base. So that describes how we got to where we are with developing Future Selwyn. It kind of outlines what the purpose of Future Selwyn is, why we need it, which is talking about that uncertainty, instability, resource scarcity, extreme weather, all those things that we were just discussing, how it represents our strategic approach, our way forward, different roles in the community, and then the role of spatial planning for the 3 separate areas. I won't go through each individual page. I'll just probably pick a few key ones. So if I go to our district, our place, which is part of the context behind where we are and where we come to work each day about, this sets up the background for the Selwyn district and different parts of the district. You've seen some of the map elements now, but I'd like to show some of the data and information that's not spatial. So we have these interactive Power BI reports. So I suppose one of the benefits compared to a document is that you have to put a lot of information, big tables, spreadsheets. People don't have the opportunity to choose what's of interest to them and to drill down or investigate a particular area. So you could look at the township. These are the same projections that we've used for the long-term plan, but now you have the ability to select the towns of interest, select the year that's of interest, and to find out how the population will change over time. So it's got real high interactivity in terms of both the maps and the non-spatial data and information, being how a population's changing and growing. So this is about the change in age groups, and you can see how we're getting older. So all this context and evidence base that's directed the background of the long-term plan, but also other strategies and plans as well. So Future Selwyn will host that, and it will be able to be updated live over time as there's changes. But I think something that's really quite exciting about this is that it's got the ability to be interactive. Talking about scenarios earlier in Rod's presentation, we have gone through a process of looking at the different futures and how things could change. This was part of an exercise to develop that strategic framework, or the vision, the outcomes, and making sure that our outcomes are fit for purpose no matter what kind of trajectory we get to the future. So we developed 4 scenarios initially. These are qualitative, and they look out beyond, the 2050 mark. We're thinking we've got climate projections out to 2100. We know these greenhouse gases we emit can stay in for hundreds, sometimes up to 1,000 years if they're long-lived gases. So it's beyond the 50 for some elements, and out to the hundreds of years. So part of that is the scenario planning, looking at how things could change, and that gives us the ability to pivot, be agile, and adapt our framework and check it remains fit for purpose. And there's the potential to add other scenarios in the future as well. So jumping to the strategy itself now, I'll focus on the strategic framework. So you would have seen this before. It's got our vision, the spirit of Selwyn, and then the separate outcomes. We've got 4 outcomes and then a range of sub-outcomes, each with directions. So we presented that at the last briefing that Waikirikiri Kitua Future Selwyn came up for, and appreciate everyone's feedback there. I have made some changes there, so if you do have time, please go through and have a look, and I try to incorporate and simplify some of the language, and yeah, really appreciate the feedback from the last briefing. Pretty much that's the main things I wanted to talk about. In terms of the framework, Rob did mention that we've been looking at the strategies that have been in development or recently adopted. So we've been looking at the One Water, the Selwyn Biodiversity Strategy, working alongside the economic development strategies to make sure that is reflected in the Future Selwyn strategic framework. But you'll see that the strategic framework kind of reflects a broad spectrum of different areas, from the natural environment to people and communities and the economy. The other thing I want to show in the strategy, and this is kind of framing up the next phase of Future Selwyn, is our strategic priorities. So these are our 6 strategic priorities. If you click onto these, they'll give you a description of kind of a definition of what that means to us in terms of future strategic work and spatial planning. But these are kind of the areas for key moves, key focus areas where work within that area will likely achieve multiple outcomes and multiple directions. So they just give us a focused approach as to how to work on those outcomes over time. That's pretty much everything I wanted to show in terms of the functionality. I probably would take the example to show a little bit more of our evidence base. So we started this process a few years ago, developing topic papers. These are kind of current state, future state papers for these subtopic areas. And this is largely the evidence base, the technical information backing the decisions behind developing the framework and the vision. And just to refer back to what Rob presented on, if you were to go into the natural environment, you'll find talking about climate change, you'll find some of the information on climate change and how it's affected the Selwyn district in particular. Again, really excellent Power BI reports, which the most recent greenhouse gas inventory for Canterbury was published recently, and that's at a territorial authority level. So these are all the emissions for the Selwyn district presented in a really great interface, so people can click on what's of an interest for them. If you're talking transport earlier, you can see the breakdown of transport emissions and the change between 2018 and 2021, which is the most recent data point. Yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to show for the platform. There's a lot to go through, so I suppose if anyone had an interest in a particular area, I'd happily show that and talk to that. But that's a flavour of everything that's in there at the moment. Oh, yeah, sorry. I will touch on it again real briefly. So we are planning to develop the area plans I mentioned before. So in our district, our place, we've got something describing our spatial approach, which I kind of glossed over before, but this describes the 3 areas that we've used for spatial planning purposes. That's the Ellesmere area, Malvern area, and Eastern Selwyn being the Selwyn portion of the Greater Christchurch area. And the Malvern and Ellesmere areas not derived from ward boundaries, they're from previous ward boundaries, but they're from Stats SA2 areas, which is really great because that means we have time series information at a really granular level in terms of population change. So we've kept those areas for our spatial planning, but that's part of the next phase, is to develop area plans for these 3 areas. Once we have a strong steer from the community that our strategic framework and those strategic priorities, those 6 priorities I showed before, housing, transport, infrastructure, etc., is how we'll frame the area plans. If we get the steer from the community that those are the right priorities and the way to go in terms of spatial planning. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, George. That was a great presentation. Sam's just temporarily stepped out. Just open the floor to any questions. Sophie.
Thank you very much, guys. It's really quite fascinating looking through the website and everything. So yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, so it's coming to the council meeting next week. Obviously, we're going to get papers and stuff like that soon, but what does consultation look like, particularly since this is a very web-based resource? Yeah, how far are we going with this? Or yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it will be in the pack for the 12th of June for our consultation approach, but it is omni-channel and mixed, and it's using traditional ways of reaching our community as well. So we're going to meet our community where they are, in person, traditional print, radio. In terms of engagement, we're planning to use Engagement HQ for that. So it is digital in that sense, but also we'll have a summary version of Waikirikiri to a Future Selwyn as a PDF, which really draws on part 3 and makes that accessible in terms of a print document. And I think that's what Wellington City Council did with their spatial plan from 2021. They have the functionality, the interactivity for the people who want to explore that, and that's an option, but they also have the key content available in a more traditional format. So it's accessible to our whole community, and that's certainly the intent. It's just been a bit more of an effort to develop the website, but the intention is to develop a PDF document as well.
And sorry, George, you're also thinking about having drop-in sessions, and there may be, and it'll come out in the paper for the requirement for councillors to participate?
Yes, I believe Natalie Carhill, who I'm going to drop in it, and she's sat in the back, will be in touch with you hopefully after next week to look at calendars, time and availability. But yeah, that is the intention, to have drop-ins. And I think Natalie explained to me that there's a lot of learnings from what worked well with the LTP consultation, and the drop-ins were really effective. It's meeting our community where they go. And it's also making sure that we're going to places where people are looking forward to engaging and talking about quite interesting things like their future, their grandchildren's future, and maybe not when they're coming to HQ and just want to go to the AA counter. It's kind of get in, get out. So we want to make sure that we pick places where people are happy to dwell, spend time and talk to us. So we've got plenty of learnings. So we think we'll have a really effective consultation with our community.
Thank you. Megan.
Yes, so kia ora. The first thing I just wanted to stop and acknowledge is last time this came before us, I said, look, I really wanted to see how it knitted together with the rest of the strategies. And my main, I was really thinking about the things that we've gone a really long way on, but not quite yet adopted, like the One Water strategy and Indigenous biodiversity strategy, and then how it linked into strategies that have been adopted. And you've taken me through, on my own, a bit of a workshop to go, here's how it links together. So I wanted to stop and acknowledge that that you did that for me. So thank you. And then the one thing that I would share from that is the assurance that I received was that, and this is a question, I am getting here, but the assurance that I received was that even once this goes through a public consultation stage and it's adopted, the idea of it is to be a living document so that we can actually start to incorporate those strategies, even if they're not perfectly incorporated yet, but I was able to see that they actually are well incorporated. But there's a opportunity for that to be changed. And I guess that's my question. I don't quite understand if it's going through a public hearing process and it's like, tick, this is it, then how does it still be able to be a living document?
It really depends on the significance of that change. So if it is a minor significance, then we can just directly, by decision of committee, we can just go do that. If it is very significant, there's some sort of massive shift in the community aspiration of where they want to take Selwyn, or where there might be a big central government legislative change where we actually need to drastically change things, and that will require a public consultation process. Ideally, this is it for the next sort of 5 to 10 years, depending on what happens, while we're still updating and feeding in those new things, but it's more of a polish or refinement rather than any wholesale direction change.
Yeah, great, thank you. And the other question that I had was, and I wasn't present this morning, so I wasn't able to go through potentially what we might look at from a governance perspective moving forward, but it was assurance that if we're going to own this as governors, then it will be our job to go to Sharon and the team and say, we want to see in our reporting back to us as governors through potentially the Finance and Performance Committee that it's being implemented. And so there's no point in having a strategy that you're just going to put on the shelf. It will be really good to understand once it's adopted what the plan is to implement it and have it as part of our everyday lives here.
It's definitely part of the strategic operating framework which we're trying to develop as a council as well. So as a council, we've grown very fast, but we still need to mature and evolve in our processes to make sure that when we do set strategic directions like this, we actually align to it whenever we create an action plan for that, or a long-term plan for this, or the district plan review for this. We've actually got processes and checks in place that make sure there's always an alignment check for each one of those.
And I'll just add to that, Megan. So what we talked about in the governance workshop this morning was actually future Selwyn as the overarching framework, and having the likes of council, finance and performance, and risk and audit as being the key governance groups, and then strategic subcommittees that have got particular priorities for this council falling out of that. So there was perhaps 4 of those, of which economic development, investment and disinvestment were one of those that maybe would report back to finance and performance. Say climate change and sustainability, which would report back through to council. Council, being whole of council, would have oversight of ensuring and holding those committees to account for making sure that it brings the strategies to life.
That's really good, because that ties in with how you opened, which is that this is going to be a document that can actually then start to enable us to go, are we going to do this or that? And it will be really directional. And my very last, it was more of a comment than question. It's about, you mentioned about potentially going to a hearing for a full consultation. And if it is a hearing of the whole of council and it's not delegated to a committee, I just thought would keep in mind that would mean that I wouldn't be participating in it because I wouldn't have a vote. Yeah.
Cool. I think probably that just on that last comment, we need to think about how that would play out, and rather than make a decision today on how that looks, we'll consider that. So thank you. Great, really good to have the presentation today. I think it's excellent to see the usability of what you've shown us, and like you said, if it's printed, it's really hard to go through tables that become out of date quickly and can be hard to navigate. But the site looks great. So thank you for the work that's been done on that. We now move on to the next item, which is the economic development strategy update, document 2 on today's agenda. And Shay and Claire.
Getting our presentation up and running. Kia ora koutou. It's great to follow up with an update on the economic development strategy. Today we're going to cover the alignment between the future Selwyn and the economic development strategy, an overview of council updates and the various opportunities for input over the past 8 months, a report back on the advisory group feedback on the draft document, and public feedback through the long-term plan submissions and our next steps.
Hopefully from George's excellent presentation and the rest of this here, you can see the alignment coming through. It won't be directly word for word because there's other elements that the future Selwyn stuff will be trying to cover, but it will kind of cover those key bits and come through in that for this one as well.
I just really wanted to show that alignment.
Alrighty, so you'll see on this slide the various updates and opportunities that Council have had to provide input into the strategy over the past 8 months, and councillors have also been receiving updates through the Community Services and Facilities quarterly report. You'll recall on the 24th of April, we delivered the economic development strategy with participation from Benji Patterson, Johnny O'Donnell, councillors, ELT and Te Taumutu Runanga representatives. The purpose of this strategy was to provide context and an overview of the steps leading up to the development of the draft, how councillors and stakeholders have shaped the draft so far, and council's role in example projects. Feedback captured from the session included that council needs to know its role in economic development, that co-funding and partnerships are important, and that strong KPIs and measures are needed to track performance. As a result of this session, Te Taumutu Runanga representatives have confirmed they're comfortable with the draft strategy and direction and have indicated interest in contributing to the implementation. And earlier in the year, during the 27th of March council briefing, we presented results of the elected member survey, where you provided feedback on the distinct traits of Selwyn and the one thing you'd expect to come from this work.
In May, 44 members of the advisory group, consisting of a range of business leaders and key partners, received the draft strategy to provide feedback on. The strategy was positively received with compliments on the draft, including constructive feedback about the council being more ambitious and attracting and retaining spend, reinforcing the significance of the agricultural sector and exports, and ensuring there's a different approach with large businesses compared to small medium enterprises. Members reiterated the importance of measures, keeping stakeholders informed in relation to the implementation, and the need for a strong communication plan to the wider business community. In the next slides, we've included quotes from some of the members that provided their feedback. You'll see, obviously, Brad Olsen, the Chief Executive of Infometrics, has been involved with economic development strategy since the beginning of our journey and was MC at our initial Business Leaders Forum in November. Brad provided some great feedback on the strategy, which we've incorporated. You'll also see Leanne Watson, the Chief Executive of Business Canterbury, formerly the Canterbury Chamber of Commerce, and Jason McRae, the Business Advisor there, provided feedback on the draft document, and we're looking forward to working more collaboratively with the organisation through the delivery of the strategy. It was great to hear support from Fonterra, particularly with their interest in specific projects outlined in the strategy.
Through the LTP process, as you know, 906 submissions were received on economic development, and 62% of submitters said they supported the continued development of the strategy. Most of the supportive submissions received aligned with the draft strategy, including supporting local workforce, visitor promotion, and dark sky accreditation. So where to from here? After presenting an update to you today, we'll continue to review feedback and refine the strategy document. Councillors can expect to receive the final strategy on the 14th of August, where we will be seeking endorsement. We will also provide an overview for how the strategy will work going forward. So we look forward to presenting the final document to you then. Thank you.
Great, thank you for presenting that. Councillor, is there any questions or comments you've got on where we're up to or where we're going? Megan.
Oh, wow. I feel like I've been absent and just come on with everything.
You know with that, yeah.
So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much for including Taumitu Runanga to appoint some representatives to be involved in the workshop. That was really important when we put it back to Taumitu to say, well, what are the things you want to be involved in? And this was identified as being really critical. And the two reasons that I heard back why it's really critical is within the document, it talks about farming for the future is one of the key strategic goals, and that's all about the whenua. And so we have always had a kaitiakitanga lens when it comes to what we want to do with whenua. And then the second part is very obviously backing Māori success. So two critical goals that are pretty obvious that we care about. So thank you for including our people, and yes, they do want to be involved in the future. When we had a bit of a work through session after the main session to go, well, what are the things that are really most important and why? Basically, and then I had a conversation one-on-one with the representatives that came, and they said, look, we're really quite comfortable with the strategy that where it's at right now, and what we're most interested in is how it's going to be implemented, and particularly when we pulled back and we heard that one of the key drivers for this was actually about stimulating GDP in this district to rise it up to the national average. And so if I'm ever going into a business in old hat when I was a consultant and going, well, what's really going wrong with the business and how do we turn it around? The first thing I would always do is going, what is the assets? And let's sweat the assets. So let's, I don't know, find an anchor tenant. Who are the big fish that we want to actually bring into the district? So I'd really hope that when we're looking in implementation, that's what we're doing. We're going, what are the assets of this district and what's it got to really realise in the future? And that linked through to my question to Dr. Carr earlier that said, well, what are the real main things that you would see here from a land use perspective that we can do differently that will make us more climate resilient? And one thing he talked about, or one of the key things he talked about was the food and fibre industry being needing to move to a controlled growing environment, and that crop failure will increase. And getting that feedback, it's hard to hear, but it linked directly into farming the future. So I feel like we're actually finding a pathway to really do governance and linking through all of our different strategies, and it lands well in this economic development strategy. So they were my comments.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Megan.
We'll note that. And we've had some feedback from Benji Patterson about not just getting to the national average in terms of productivity, but exceeding it. So we've been able to incorporate that.
Thanks. Could you give us a bit of an understanding of how this works, like as the document guides decision making and things? So, say there's a great business in Gisborne, and they're thinking about expansion, and we hear about how good they are, and think that there's real opportunity and so on. Like at the moment, we don't really play in that game at all, unless they find cheap land and decide that it's the right thing to do because we can hook onto the wastewater and they make it happen themselves. Will this strategy change our approach to market ourselves, both nationally and internationally?
Yes, it will. So business attraction is a big part of it. And so it was great to hear Rod talking about that being key, attracting high value, talent and high value businesses. And I'm also going to look at Natalie because part of it is about that kind of marketing of what's here and what the assets are. And speaking to Megan's point too, it is about being really clear about what the assets are and what we do have and what we do have to offer and being able to communicate that really well.
Any other questions or comments from?
Yes, Sam.
Yeah, Shane.
Thank you. If I'm just sort of thank you very much for this and great work so far. Just sort of drawing together all of the conversations that we've had up to this point today from Rod Carr as well, and thinking about transition and really Megan's corridor around providing opportunity through this strategy really does, I guess, foster innovation and thereby draw talent by producing a potential 50-year business case that allows for transition of potentially land use into something quite transformative that contributes not only to the commercial return but also to innovative, high-skilled either manufacturing or energy change transformation. So I think it's a really important piece of work that you've embarked on and that we all have to really shape the future under the future of Selwyn. So congratulations. Thank you.
Oh, hi there. Just on page 13, Rob Stevens from Fonterra made a couple of comments. He said he's interested in learning more about the energy plan and the Living Lab initiative. Is that in any of our documents or is that something that we're going to see in the future? I'm just quite interested in it too.
They are two of the Catalyst projects. So we will be developing those up and getting really specific about the actions within those.
Yeah, mine's just a wee thing in between the last time we talked about this and today. I had reason to read something that kind of struck a chord, and then I was just going to quote something because it was. I feel like this is where we're trying to head, and I don't know if we've stated it, but I don't know how anybody else thought it was. It's from a report overseas, and it said the purpose of sustainable business is to solve the problems of people and planet profitably, while not profiting from causing problems. And that's kind of where we seem to be at the moment, like in the sense that there's a lot of the profit going on, but there's a lot of the problem creation. I guess I'm just trying to keep an eye on the fact that we don't actually want to encourage more of that. And I think that's where this document is going, but there's always going to be people who want to test it or who want to minimize, yeah, but this is okay because we've traded it off somewhere, but actually those problems still accumulate. So it's kind of just trying to keep that in mind, I guess, from my end.
It would be great if you wouldn't mind forwarding us, if you have that article, that would be fantastic.
Cool. Thank you for the work on that and presenting it today. We look forward to coming back to Council. Councillors, that brings us to the end of the public workshop. So we'll close off the recording and sharing.